The needle went in for the 9th time that week. Nora did not flinch. She had learned early in the very first month at Sigma 9 that flinching gave them data. Every small movement, every sharp breath, every tightening of her jaw got recorded, filed, and discussed in low voices outside her cell door. So she had stopped giving them any of that. She lay still on the hard white table, stared at the ceiling above her, and counted the ventilation cycles overhead. Slow in, long pause, slow out. Every 44 seconds exactly. The Dravith technician standing beside her made a quiet sound, something between a hiss and a click, which Nora had come to understand as mild frustration. He checked the readout on his device, checked it again. Then he crossed the room and spoke to his colleague in rapid Dravith standard, a language Nora was not supposed to know. She understood most of it now. He was saying the pain receptor calibration must be wrong again. The human showed no response at all. The device was probably broken. It was the 3rd time this month he had flagged it. Nora said nothing. She kept her eyes on the ceiling. She kept counting. 3 years was a long time to spend in one room. Long enough to learn a foreign language through the walls. Long enough to memorize the shift rotations of every staff member, the maintenance schedule of every door seal, and the mineral content of the condensation that gathered each night on the lower vent grate. Long enough to notice that the 3rd ventilation cycle of the evening shift ran exactly 4 seconds longer than every other cycle, a small mechanical quirk that nobody had ever bothered to fix. She had been counting those 4 seconds for 7 months, waiting for the right combination of other things to fall into place around them. Administrator Ruth came through the research wing that afternoon. He was a large Dravith broad across the middle, with the flat face and gray-green skin that was common to his administrative caste. He walked through the facility the way powerful people walk through places they own, slowly, hands behind his back, looking at everything without really seeing any of it. He stopped in front of the glass panel, outside Nora's holding cell. She was sitting on the floor, eyes closed. She looked, as she so often did, like a person who had simply decided to be somewhere else in her mind. Ruth studied her with the same mild curiosity a person might bring to studying a fish in a tank, something that breathed, something that was alive, but not something that required serious thought. He turned to the lead researcher. Still no stress indicators. None that read as meaningful, the researcher said. We keep flagging it as equipment error, but the equipment has been replaced twice now. The results are the same. Cognitive condition. Responsive, cooperative, no signs of breakdown. She eats consistently. She sleeps 8 hours. She does not ask for things anymore. Ruth pulled out a data pad. He scrolled to the general classification file on humanity and reviewed it briefly. At the bottom of the file was a footnote added years ago by a survey xenobiologist during the first extended study of Earth. The footnote described a small creature called the honey badger. It noted that the animal was physically unremarkable, slow, poorly armored, outmatched by almost every meaningful predator in its region. The footnote also said it was one of the most difficult animals on the planet to kill. It had been tagged as biologically anomalous, flagged for further study, then buried under 4 decades of other data and never followed up on. Ruth read the footnote, made a short dismissive sound, and handed the pad back. Keep documenting the subject, he said, but do not allocate more resources to her. She is a curiosity, not a priority. He looked through the glass one final time. Harmless, he said quietly, and walked away down the corridor. Nora opened her eyes. She had heard every word. In the corner of her cell, under the edge of her sleeping mat, sat a small container she had built herself over 2 months. She had made it from a cracked meal tray segment and a strip of seal foam she had worked out of a hairline crack in the lower wall, pulling a tiny piece free each night, slowly enough that the damage never showed on the structural sensors. Inside the container was a compound she had been building for the past 4 months. She had not given it a name. Naming things made them feel finished, and she was not finished yet. The Dravith sensory system was their greatest biological asset. It ran through the skin and respiratory passages, a dense web of chemical receptors that could read an environment the way no human sense could. They felt stress in the air before they saw it on a face. They detected trace biological compounds from across a room. They knew when something was wrong before any logical process had caught up to it. It was what made them effective administrators, effective soldiers, effective everything. Nora had been studying it for 3 years. She had also been quietly cultivating a biological compound using the only raw materials she had available: her own skin cells, metabolic byproducts processed out of her food, trace minerals from the vent condensation, and time. Enormous amounts of time. What she was building would not harm anyone. It was not designed to. It was designed to make her unreadable to those receptors for a short and specific window, long enough to walk through a room and register as nothing. Not a threat. Not a presence, not even a smell. It was the same principle the honey badger used when it walked into a beehive. It did not fight the bees. It did not hide from them. It made itself unreadable, and then it walked straight through to what it wanted. Nora picked up the container. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the weight of it. Then she put it back. Not tonight. The third ventilation cycle was off by 2 seconds this week. Something in the mechanical rhythm was slightly out of phase, and she needed the full 4-second gap, not 2. She also needed the researcher with the slower key response pattern to be on shift, and she needed the Vessi cargo freighter she had been tracking by its docking vibrations through the wall to be on its regular Thursday arrival. Thursday was 4 days away. She lay back down on the mat. She closed her eyes. She let the hours move through her the way she had learned to let them, without fighting them, without counting them as losses, without any of the desperation the Dravith researchers had clearly expected her to develop by now. They had been waiting for her to break. She understood that. She had watched them check their instruments and recalibrate their expectations month after month, waiting for the moment when the isolation and the testing and the smallness of the room would finally register on their sensors as suffering. It registered as nothing, because she had decided, a long time ago, that a cell was only a place where thinking happened undisturbed, and she had a great deal to think about. She had been making a list for 3 years. A long, careful, detailed list of everything she had learned about the Dravith sovereignty from the inside of a research station they had put her in because they thought she was not worth watching closely. It was a very long list. Thursday could not come fast enough. There was no alarm, no running, no dramatic last-second sprint through a closing blast door. Nora walked out of Sigma 9 the same way water finds a drain, quietly, without hurry, following the exact shape of the path that had been left open for her. The compound she had spent 4 months building worked exactly as she had calculated. The Dravith researchers on the evening floor did not look up when she passed them. Their chemical receptors swept the air and found nothing worth reacting to. She was a blank, a gap, a space where a person was not. She did not run. Running made heat. Running made sound. Running was what prey did, and she had spent 3 years practicing not being prey. She moved through the eastern corridor at a steady pace, down 2 levels in the maintenance lift, which ran on a timer and needed no keycard at this hour, through the secondary equipment bay, unlocked every Thursday between 6 and 8 in the evening to receive incoming cargo, and into the open loading belly of a Vessi trade freighter still running its unload cycle before it sealed and departed. She found a space between 2 large freight containers. She folded herself into it and went still. The freighter sealed 20 minutes later. The docking clamps let go with a deep mechanical thud she felt in her back teeth. And then the lights of Sigma 9 were sliding away behind the porthole glass, getting smaller. And the particular recycled metallic smell of that station, which she had breathed every day for 3 years, until she did not notice it anymore, was gone. She gave herself 30 seconds. She had promised herself 30 seconds. She counted them, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she had stopped knowing it was there. Then she moved. A Vessi cargo handler found her 6 hours into the journey when he came into the hold to check a loose container strap and nearly put his foot through her hand. He made a sound like a pressurized line releasing and backed against the far wall. The Vessi were small people, compact and quick, with wide dark eyes and copper-colored skin, and the general appearance of a species that had survived by being very alert to things that were out of place. Nora looked up at him. She said, in Vessi trade pidgin she had learned through 2 years of overheard dock conversations at Sigma 9, "I am not here to cause problems. I need passage to a neutral station. I have no money, but I am willing to work." The handler stared at her. Then he went to get the captain. The captain was a Vessi woman named Oru who looked at Nora the way a person looks at unexpected weather, not panicked, but assessing, trying to decide how much trouble this was actually going to be. She looked at the research subject ID still clipped to Nora's sleeve, the one Nora had kept on purpose, because under sovereignty legal code a research subject had different standing than a fugitive, and the difference mattered. She looked at the hold around her. She looked at the stars outside. Then she said, in trade pidgin, "They will search this ship when they find out you are gone." "They will notice in about 10 hours, Nora said. "The researcher assigned to my evening check marks his reports complete before he does them. He has been doing it for 4 months. I noticed in month 1. Oru was quiet for a moment. "You are very calm." "I have been calm for 3 years, Nora said. "It stopped being difficult around month 8. Something in that answer seemed to close a decision for Oru. She told Nora to stay in the hold, eat from the crew supply, and keep out of sight. She did not ask for anything in return, and she did not explain why. Nora did not ask. She had a strong suspicion that the Vessi as a people had many small, quiet reasons not to feel any particular loyalty towards sovereignty protocols. She filed that thought and moved on. Alone again in the hold, Nora sat with her back against a freight container and began processing everything. 3 years of captivity had also been 3 years of education. The Draveth had not kept her in a sealed and silent room. They had worked around her, talked around her, run their systems around her, because she was a low-priority subject in a busy facility and nobody had thought to worry about what she might be learning. She had heard thousands of hours of conversations she was not supposed to understand, in a language she was not expected to learn. She had watched administrative systems, patrol cycles, internal communications, supply schedules. She had seen how the sovereignty sorted species, how they calculated threat levels, how they decided where to concentrate security and where to leave things open. Humans sat at the very bottom of that system, not even listed as a category that required consideration. The administrative equivalent of leaving a door unlocked because no one of any importance could possibly come through it. Nora thought about this for a long time. She thought about 3 people. Del Akafer, a human trade negotiator she had heard mentioned in a Draveth financial briefing in her 2nd year, flagged as a low-concern human representative active in the Sovereignty Economic Border Zone. Low concern, of course. Yara Bloom, a human biomedical engineer who had taken a contract with a Draveth pharmaceutical company. Nora had seen the contract approval pass through Sigma 9's communication relay, approved without hesitation. Routine. No concern raised. The third was someone Nora had never heard named directly. But for 18 months she had been seeing fragments of an information network moving through the background noise of Draveth trade communications, small, careful, built with the specific architecture of someone who understood that the best networks look like ordinary conversation. She had spent months mapping the structure without knowing who was at the center. The map told her what kind of person it was, even if it didn't give her a name. She would find him. She was good at finding things nobody had thought to hide from her. She asked Oru for access to the ship's outgoing trade band transmitter. It was the low-frequency channel used by Vessi merchants for cargo manifests and price data, The sovereignty monitored it but had never invested in proper counter-encryption because the channel was considered harmless. Trade frequencies, merchant chatter, nothing worth protecting against. Oru said yes, with the expression of someone who had already decided they were in this and might as well see where it went. Nora sat at the transmitter. 3 years of preparation, 3 years of watching and waiting and counting and learning. The message she sent was 3 words long. She sent it. Then she sat back and ate half a Vessi ration bar, which tasted like compressed grain and mild regret, and looked at the stars through the narrow porthole above the cargo containers. The sovereignty had stood for 600 years. It had fleets and military installations and bureaucratic systems that reached across 40 worlds. It had biological classification tables that sorted every known species by danger level, and it used those tables to decide where to look and where not to look. It was not looking at Nora. She finished the ration bar. She did not feel small. She had stopped feeling small a long time ago, sometime in that second year when she had understood that the room they had put her in was only a room if she agreed to let it be one. What she felt now, sitting in the dark hold of a Vessi freighter moving quietly through the outer edge of sovereignty space, was the particular satisfaction of a person who has finished waiting and started working. She pulled her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes. She ran through her list one more time from the beginning, every observation, every pattern, every small overlooked detail the Dravith had handed her simply by believing she was not worth watching. It was a very long list. She smiled in the dark. It was going to be enough. Halcyon Drift was the kind of place that existed because nobody had bothered to claim it. It sat at the junction of 3 different trade corridors, technically inside the boundary of sovereignty map space, but practically ignored by everyone with any actual power. The station was old, patched, and ran on a power system that 3 separate engineering teams had declared unsafe over the past 2 decades without anyone doing anything about it. The docking bays smelled like recycled coolant and fried grain, and the corridors were full of Vessi merchants, Thune freight handlers, and humans who had found that operating in the gaps between powerful things was a reasonable way to live. It was exactly the kind of place Nora needed. She arrived on a Vessi supply shuttle 8 days after leaving Sigma 9. Oru had taken her as far as the Vessi distribution hub at the edge of the border zone, handed her a small packet of Vessi trade tokens without comment, and said only, "Try not to bring trouble back this direction." Nora had said she would do her best. Oru had looked at her with those wide dark eyes and said, "That is not as reassuring as you think it is." And then the shuttle door had closed. Del Akafer was already at Halcyon Drift when Nora arrived. He was sitting at a corner table in the station's main eating area, working through a bowl of something gray and steaming, with a stack of trade documents beside him that made him look exactly like what the Dravith system had him filed as a low-level human commerce representative, working an unremarkable contract route. He was a big man, somewhere in his early 50s, soft-spoken and slow-moving, with reading glasses perched on his nose and the general appearance of someone whose most dangerous quality was his patience in a negotiation room. He saw Nora cross the floor and said nothing until she sat down across from him. Then he pushed the bowl of gray food to one side and said, "You look better than I expected." "I expected worse from the outside too," Nora said. "I got your message. I know you're here." He looked at her for a moment. 3 words is a very short message for what I assume is a very large request. The channel wasn't secure enough for more. Nora said, "And you knew what it meant." Del nodded slowly. He did know. They had worked together briefly 8 years ago on a joint research and trade survey near the outer boundary, and in that time they had talked about a lot of things, including the small paper Nora had been writing about extreme biology on Earth, about the specific survival strategies of species that seemed outmatched by every measure and kept surviving anyway. He had read the honey badger section 3 times. He remembered what she had said about it. He had thought about it more than once since. Yara Bloom arrived the following morning on a pharmaceutical courier shuttle, carrying a standard medical kit and the calm, precise manner of someone who processed the world in data and found it manageable that way. She was 29, with close-cut hair and the kind of stillness that came from spending long hours in laboratory environments where unexpected movements broke experiments. She sat down at the table, looked at Nora and said, "You look like someone who just spent 3 years in a Dravath holding facility." "I did," Nora said. "How is your health?" "Good enough to do what needs doing." Yara nodded as if this was a satisfactory answer and opened her kit to confirm it herself. The third person arrived that evening. He came into the eating area from the service corridor at the back, which was not technically a public entrance, and sat down with the ease of a man who had used back entrances for so long that they felt more natural than front doors. His name was Rael Sando, and he was 44 years old, with gray beginning at his temples and the specific quality of alertness that comes from years of moving through spaces where being noticed is the worst thing that can happen to you. He had been an information journalist once, in a life that felt far away now. These days he moved information differently, quietly, carefully, through a network of contacts across a dozen species that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary trading gossip loop. He looked at Nora, he looked at Del and Yara, then he said, "You want to take down an empire." "I want to unmake what holds it together," Nora said. "That is not quite the same thing." Rael considered this. "Walk me through it." She did. It took 2 hours. She laid it out from the beginning what she had observed at Sigma 9, what she understood about the sovereignty's internal structure, where the pressure points were, and what she believed would happen if the right things were introduced into the right systems in the right order. She was not proposing a war. She was not proposing sabotage in any form the sovereignty would recognize as such. Every piece of what she described was quiet, deniable, and designed to look like something the sovereignty had done to itself. When she finished, there was a long silence at the table. Del spoke first. "You want to use 4 people with no weapons, no fleet, and no formal standing to destabilize a 600-year-old interstellar empire through biology, economics, and information." "Yes," Nora said. Another silence. "And you believe this will work," Yara said. It was not quite a question. "I believe it will work because they will never see it coming," Nora said. "They do not watch us. They have never watched us. We are not in any category they consider worth protecting against. That is not a weakness on our side. That is the only opening we need." Rael turned a small coin-shaped Vessi token over in his fingers. "The honey badger doesn't fight the lion," he said slowly. "It doesn't need to," Nora said. "It just doesn't stop." Rael set the token down. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need from my network." What Nora needed from Rael was reach. His contact web stretched across every major client species under the sovereignty: the Vessi, the Thune, the Korathi, and 6 others. These were species that traded under sovereignty agreements, ran supply chains inside sovereignty space, and had been quietly, carefully unhappy about that arrangement for a very long time. They were not rebels. They were not organized. But they were watching, and they were tired, and what they needed was not a leader. What they needed was accurate information, documentation of what the sovereignty was actually doing with their trade agreements, their resource commitments, their administrative promises. Truth, delivered carefully, through channels that could not be tied back to any of the 4 people sitting at this table. What she needed from Yara was specific and biological. During 2 years inside a Dravath pharmaceutical company, Yara had been doing exactly what Nora had expected, studying Dravath biochemistry from the inside. And she had found something. The Dravath immune and neural system depended heavily on a symbiotic microorganism. They carried internally a small biological partner that produced a key protein for higher cognitive regulation. Without it, the Dravath did not become ill in any obvious way. They became foggy, slow in decisions, prone to small errors that compounded over time. A very specific compound, introduced very quietly into the right pharmaceutical supply line, would disrupt that symbiosis in senior administrators for months before anyone noticed the pattern, and it would look exactly like occupational stress. Because in the sovereignty's own medical literature, the symptoms were already described that way. What she needed from Dell was the money problem. He had spent 20 years inside sovereignty economic zones and had access to financial data that most humans never touched. He had identified 3 resource worlds whose biological output underwrote the sovereignty's entire currency reserve mechanism. He knew which financial instruments were leveraged against those worlds, and he knew which Vessi and Thune intermediary contracts could be quietly, legally restructured to redirect the flow of that output over a period of 8 to 10 months. It would not look like an attack. It would look like market adjustment. By the time anyone understood what had actually happened, the leverage would already be gone. Dell looked at his trade documents on the table beside him and said, "I have been moving toward this for 2 years without knowing where I was going." "You were going here," Nora said. He picked up his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "How long do we have before they realize you're gone and connect it to anything?" "They will know I am gone by tomorrow morning," Nora said. "They will not connect it to anything meaningful for at least a year. They rated me low priority. Low priority subjects do not get complex follow-up investigations." Rail smiled. It was a small, careful smile. "They put you in a box to study you," he said, "and instead you studied them." "They gave me 3 years with nothing to do," Nora said. "What did they expect?" Nobody had an answer to that. Outside the porthole at the far end of the eating area, the stars were very still and very cold. The Sovereignty's nearest patrol route passed 80,000 kilometers from Halcyon Drift and moved on a fixed schedule that the station's traders all knew by heart, because knowing it was good for business. It would not pass this direction for another 9 hours. 9 hours was more than enough. They ordered more food and got to work. 8 months passed, nothing exploded. That was, in its own way, the most important thing. Empires expect to be attacked from outside. They build walls and fleets and patrol routes to deal with things that come at them directly. They write threat assessments and run military exercises and staff entire departments with people whose job is to watch the horizon for approaching danger. The Dravath sovereignty was very good at all of this. It had practiced for 600 years. What it had not practiced was looking at itself. Yara Bloom's part of the work had gone in first, because it needed time. She had returned to her pharmaceutical contract 4 days after the meeting at Halcyon Drift, carrying nothing unusual and behaving like someone who had taken a short personal leave and come back refreshed. The compound she had brought with her was small enough to fit inside a standard lab sample container, and it entered the Dravath pharmaceutical supply chain inside a batch of routine nutritional supplements that were shipped every quarter to the administrative complexes on the 3 core sovereignty worlds. She did not feel good about this part. She had not pretended to feel good about it. She had sat with it for a long time, run every calculation she could think of, checked it against every medical standard she held herself to, and only proceeded when she was completely sure of one thing: no one would die. No one would suffer in any way that left a mark. The disruption was targeted, temporary, and built with a biological switch she controlled. The senior administrators who took those supplements would begin making small errors. They would feel tired. They would feel as though the work was harder than it used to be and that their staff were less reliable than they remembered. They would not, under any circumstances, think it was someone else's doing, because the Dravath medical literature already had a name for this condition. They called it executive cognitive strain. It was well documented. It happened to administrators under long-term pressure. It was, medically speaking, expected. The first sign showed up 6 weeks in. in a routine administrative review on the second core world. Three senior officers gave conflicting assessments of the same logistics report at the same session. This had never happened between these particular officers before. It was logged as an unusual event and attributed to budget pressure. The session moved on. 2 weeks after that, a Dravath High Command communication regarding a disputed trade boundary with the Thune went out with the wrong coordinates. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough that the responding Thune delegation spent 11 days in the wrong sector of space before anyone noticed. The incident was logged as a mapping error. Procedures were updated. The officers involved were counseled privately and told to rest more. The errors continued. They were always small. They were never dramatic enough to trigger a formal investigation. They were exactly the kind of thing that happens in a large organization under normal strain, except that they were happening more often, and they were happening in clusters around the same administrative tier, and nobody in that tier was in any state to notice the pattern clearly, because the same compound that was causing the errors was also making it harder to see patterns. Del Akefer's work was slower and quieter still. He had been spending his days exactly as the sovereignty expected a human trade representative to spend them in offices, in meeting rooms, reviewing contracts, attending dull economic sessions, being politely ignored by the Dravath financial officers who saw him as a useful but unimportant fixture of the border trade system. Nobody watched what he read. Nobody tracked which minor contract clauses he flagged for revision, or which Vessi and Thune intermediary firms he recommended for renegotiated supply agreements, or which tariff classifications he quietly had restructured through 3 layers of legal paperwork. Each individual change was legal, each was defensible, each made sense in isolation. Together, they were slowly redirecting the biological resource output of 2 of the 3 resource worlds that backed the sovereignty's financial reserve system. Not suddenly, not sharply. The way a river is redirected by changing the shape of the ground around it one small piece at a time, until the water has been going the new way for so long that it does not remember the old one. Dell filed his reports as required. He attended his meetings. He ate his meals and went to his quarters and slept soundly, which was either the sign of a man at peace with what he was doing or the sign of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that some things needed doing even when they were not comfortable. Probably both. Rail Sando's network moved like water too, but faster. He was not releasing accusations. He was not publishing claims or writing dramatic reports for the galactic press. He was doing what he had always done, moving information from people who had it to people who needed it, through channels that looked, from the outside, like the normal trading gossip of people with too much time between cargo runs, except that the information flowing through his network now was documentation, financial records, administrative correspondence, internal memos about the disputed resource agreements between the sovereignty and its client species, data about supply commitments the sovereignty had made and then quietly reduced without notifying the receiving parties. All of it accurate, all of it verifiable, none of it accompanied by any interpretation or argument, just the documents themselves arriving through trusted contact channels in the hands of the people who needed to read them. Among the Vessi, those documents circulated among trading families who had been underpaid on supply contracts for 6 years and had not known why. Among the Thune, they reached the freight guilds who had been paying elevated transit fees to the sovereignty, without knowing those fees had no authorized basis in the agreements they had signed. Among the Korathi, they arrived at the government administrative offices and were read in silence by a minister who had been told twice in the past 2 years that the resource agreements were functioning correctly. She read the documents. She compared them to what she had been told. She put them in a folder and told no one outside her immediate office. She was not ready to move yet, but she was building to it. Meanwhile, in the sovereignty's internal security department, An investigation was underway. Not into any of the above. The sovereignty did not yet know any of the above was connected. They had identified three separate problems: the administrative performance decline on the core worlds, the unusual trading fluctuations in the border resource zones, and a slight increase in what they were calling information irregularities among client species. They had three different investigative teams working each problem independently. All three teams were staffed with administrators from the same tier that had been receiving the compromised supplements. All three teams were producing reports that were thorough, detailed, and slightly off in ways that no single reader could quite put their finger on. Ruth, who had been assigned oversight of the performance investigation in addition to his regular duties, was finding it difficult to concentrate. He had been telling himself for 2 months that he was simply tired. He had increased his rest hours. The tiredness did not improve. He looked at his team's reports and felt the conclusions sliding away from him before he could quite grip them. He blamed his staff. His staff blamed each other. The investigation moved in slow circles. In his private files, growing dusty in a low-priority archive, was a report about the escape of a human research subject from Sigma-9. It had been rated low priority because the subject was human, the breach was small, and there was no evidence of external assistance. The file noted her name, her former research classification, and one physical detail that had been logged during her years at the station: an unusually high tolerance for physical stress and an anomalous capacity to function normally in extended isolation. The file also contained the footnote from her original classification, the one about the honey badger. Nobody had reread it. And Nora, 8 months in, was sitting in a rented room on a Vessi orbital trading platform at the outer edge of the border zone, reviewing the incoming data from all three operations on a small second-hand data pad, cross-referencing patterns and adjusting timelines. She was not rushing. She had never rushed. She was also writing. She had been writing for 3 months now, a long, technical scientific paper on the taxonomy of biological resilience, built around examples from Earth and structured in the dry, careful language of academic work. It would not be exciting to read. It would not attract attention from anyone who was not a specialist. But encoded inside the structure of its examples, the order of its case studies, and the specific framing of its conclusions was a complete and detailed account of what she had done and why it had worked. She was not writing it for now. She was writing it for whoever came after in whatever form that took. Humans had a habit of solving things and then forgetting to write down how. She did not intend to make that mistake. She submitted it to an interspecies academic archive under a quiet pen name. It would sit there unread for years, probably. That was fine. It was a seed, not a flower. She set down the data pad. Outside her window, the Vessi platform turned slowly in the dark, and the lights of 100 small trade ships moved past like slow-moving stars. 8 months down, the plan was running. The sovereignty did not know it was in trouble yet. It would. The Korathi minister's name was Dissa, and she had been in government long enough to know that the most dangerous moment in any political situation is the one just before the first person moves. Everything before that moment is pressure, quiet, invisible, building in the walls of the structure without showing on the surface. And then one person moves, and suddenly the pressure has a direction, and everything that was quietly holding still rushes to follow it. She had been sitting on the documents Rails network had delivered for 6 weeks. She had read them 4 times. She had compared them against the official sovereignty communications her government had received. She had had 2 private conversations with the heads of the Thun Freight Guild, carefully worded conversations that never said anything directly, but confirmed what she already suspected, which was that the Thun had the same documents and the same questions, and were waiting for the same thing she was waiting for. Someone to move first. She authorized the formal withdrawal notice on a Tuesday. No announcement, no press statement ahead of time, just the legal document filed through the proper intergovernmental channels, notifying the Dravath sovereignty that the Korathi were withdrawing from their current resource and trade compact and initiating a renegotiation process under the terms of the original founding agreement, terms the sovereignty had been quietly violating for 11 years, as the documents made very clear. The notice landed in the sovereignty administrative offices at the same time on the same day for 12 different recipient departments, because Dessa had studied the sovereignty's communication routing system and knew that sending to all 12 at once would prevent any single department from sitting on it while they decided what to do. The sovereignty's response took 19 hours. 19 hours was an extraordinary length of time. Standard response protocol for a compact withdrawal notice was 4 hours. The delay was noticed immediately by every government that was watching, and after 6 weeks of circulating documents, a great many governments were watching. When the response finally came, it was 3 separate and contradictory official statements, issued by 3 different sovereignty ministries within a 6-hour window of each other. The first said the Korathi withdrawal notice was being reviewed as a procedural matter. The second said the withdrawal was not legally valid under current compact terms. The third said the sovereignty welcomed open dialogue about compact renewal. None of them acknowledged the documents. Dessa read all 3 statements in her office in sequence and then sat quietly for a moment. Then she forwarded them to the Thun Freight Guild head with a 1-line note that said, "Now you see it too." The Thun moved the following week. After that it went quickly, though quickly in this context meant weeks, not days, because governments move at the speed of paperwork and procedure and careful consultation, not at the speed of a decision. But the direction was clear. The Vesey trading families, whose documents had been circulating for months, issued a collective statement through their council requesting an independent audit of their supply contracts. 2 smaller client species governments sent quiet diplomatic inquiries to the sovereignty asking for clarification of resource agreement terms. The sovereign financial press, which had been reporting on unusual market fluctuations in the border resource zone for 3 months, suddenly had a context for those fluctuations and began reporting on it very differently. The sovereignty's financial index dropped 8 points in 4 days. Ruth, who was still heading the administrative performance investigation and still struggling to form clear conclusions, was now also tasked with coordinating the Korathi response. He held 3 meetings about it in 1 week. The 3 meetings produced 3 different proposed responses that his team could not agree on. He sent 2 of them. Then he sent a correction. Then he sent a second correction amending the first correction. The Korathi government received all 4 communications and did not respond to any of them. In the Sovereignty Financial Ministry, a team of analysts was trying to understand what had happened to the resource output from the border zone worlds. The numbers did not make sense. Supply was present, but it was flowing differently through different intermediary contracts, toward different processing destinations, under tariff classifications that someone had very carefully, very legally restructured over the past 8 months. Every step of the restructure was documented and defensible. There was no single point where anything wrong had happened. The river had simply changed direction while everyone was watching the surface of the water. The analysts filed an urgent report. The report went to 3 senior administrators. 2 of them misread the key table. The third understood it but drafted a response that was too slow reaching the right people, because the department coordinator had been on rest leave for 3 weeks on advice of the sovereignty's own occupational health service, which had been seeing a significant uptick in cognitive strain cases among senior staff for the past 6 months, and was quietly baffled by it. Yara, watching the occupational health reports that passed through the pharmaceutical company's research network, decided it was time. She had the antidote distributed through the same supply chain she had used to introduce the disruption, packaged as a quarterly formula update to the nutritional supplements. The effect would clear over 3 to 4 weeks. By the time the senior administrators were thinking cleanly again, the damage to the sovereignty's position would already be permanent. But she was not going to let them stay impaired indefinitely. She had made that promise to herself at the start, and she kept it. Rael, watching the information landscape shift around him, released the final layer of documentation not through quiet contact channels this time, but through 12 independent information brokers across 6 species, simultaneously with full sourcing and verification. Not accusations, not arguments, just the complete record, financial data, administrative communications, resource diversion evidence, compact violation timelines. The sovereignty called it fabricated. They issued a formal denial within hours. The denial said the documents were false, but the documents contained references that could be independently cross-checked against public sovereignty records. 3 separate research institutions, VESI, Thune, and 1 independent interspecies academic body, confirmed the cross-references within 48 hours. The denial collapsed. Nobody declared war. Nobody issued ultimatums. The sovereignty was not overthrown. It did not fall apart in a day or a week. What happened was quieter and harder to stop. It simply lost the thing it had always run on, which was the absolute certainty, held by everyone watching it, that it was too strong and too permanent to challenge. Once that certainty was gone, it did not come back. Nora was in her rented room on the Vessi platform when the Korathi notice became public. She watched the sovereignty's 3 contradictory responses come in and noted the timestamps. She tracked the Thune announcement. She watched the financial index reports. She watched the information brokers release the documents and watched the sovereignty's denial fail its first credibility test. She ate a meal. A real one, Vessi flatbread and a thick-grained stew that was better than anything she had eaten in 3 years at Sigma 9. She finished it. She sat for a while in the quiet. She did not feel triumph. She was not sure what she felt exactly. Not quite relief. Something more like the particular sensation of watching a calculation come out to the right answer, the quiet satisfaction of a thing that was supposed to work, working. She thought about the honey badger, not the footnote in the Draveth file, the real animal, the one she had written about in her first paper years ago when she was 26 and trying to explain to a lecture hall full of students why resilience was not the same as strength. The honey badger did not win because it was stronger than the things around it. It won because it had decided, somewhere deep in whatever passed for its psychology, that stopping was simply not an option it was willing to consider. She thought about 3 years of being in a cell and being told, in the quiet language of institutions, that she did not matter. She thought about counting ventilation cycles. She thought about Oru on the freighter, and Del eating gray food at a corner table, and Yara asking about her health like it was the most important question in the room, and Rael flipping a coin-shaped token between his fingers in the back half of a station that smelled like coolant. Then she picked up a new data pad and started planning the next thing. She had received a message that morning from a human research office asking whether she was available for an outer band survey mission. 17 uncontacted species in the far reach, long travel times, poor communication infrastructure, minimal sovereignty presence. Minimal, not none. She wrote back to say she was interested. She would need 3 months to close her current work. In the far distance, the sovereignty's 4th official response to the Korathi withdrawal was already being drafted, this time by a committee of administrators who were, thanks to Yara's antidote, beginning to think more clearly. Too late for the decisions already made, but maybe not too late for what came after. Nora hoped, with the small, tired kind of hope that comes from having done something difficult and knowing the world is still complicated, that what came after would be better. She sent the reply, she sealed it, she started on her notes. There was always more work. The Human Interstellar Council met in a building on a space station that nobody had given a name to yet, because the people who built it had argued for 2 years about what to name it, and eventually agreed to leave it for a future committee. It had been 4 years since the future committee was formed. The building still had no name. The hearing room was functional but not impressive. Long table, neutral walls, a row of council members on one side, a single chair on the other. The kind of room that was designed not to feel like anything, so that the thing happening inside it could feel like everything. Nora sat in the single chair. She had been in this room 3 times over the past 2 days, because the council had asked her to come back after each of the others. Del and Yara and Rael had each given their accounts. The council had been polite. It had also been visibly confused not about the facts, which were documented thoroughly, but about what to do with the facts, which was a different problem entirely. A council member named Holt, who had the permanently exhausted look of a person trying to understand something by asking the wrong questions, leaned forward and said, "Dr. Selby, let me be direct. In the past 14 months, 8 sovereignty client species have either withdrawn from or begun renegotiating their agreements. The sovereignty's financial index has contracted by 31%. Their administrative tier has undergone a reform process that their own government has described as unprecedented. 4 independent investigations are underway inside the sovereignty examining what went wrong and how. And at the center of all of this, according to the documentation before this council, are 4 human civilians with no military rank, no formal government authorization, and as far as this council can determine, no weapons of any kind." He paused. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" Nora looked at him. "Biology," she said. "I was doing biology." He stared at her. "I was a xenobiologist before I was a prisoner," she said. "I stayed a xenobiologist during. I applied what I know to the situation I was in. That is what scientists do." A different council member, a woman named Vera who had been taking careful notes throughout, and had the manner of someone who always asked the question that mattered most and then waited, said, "You destabilized a governing authority across 40 worlds. Did you consider the consequences for the populations living under that authority, for the transition period, for what happens in the spaces where the sovereignty's administrative systems are now failing?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I considered them for 3 years in a cell at Sigma 9. I also considered what happens to the populations under the sovereignty when the authority functions normally. The client species documents are in the record, the resource diversions, the broken compact terms, the difference in what was promised and what was delivered. I did not make a decision that had no costs. I made a decision where the costs of acting were smaller than the costs of not acting. I could be wrong. I have been wrong before, but I made that calculation and I stand by it." Vera wrote something. She said, without looking up, "And if this council determines that what you did constitutes a violation of interstellar governance protocols, then this council should say so clearly and explain which protocols were violated," Nora said. "I have reviewed the relevant frameworks. I did not find a prohibition on scientific observation, economic research, or sharing accurate information. If there is one, I would like to see it." The room was quiet for a moment. Holt opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You were one person in a holding cell." "Yes," Nora said. "Against a 600-year-old empire." "Yes." "And you," he stopped. He seemed to be trying to find words for something he did not have a proper category for. "You thought you could." "I knew I could not force the outcome," Nora said. "Nobody can force an outcome at that scale. I created the conditions in which the outcome became likely. There is a difference." She paused. "The honey badger cannot beat a lion in a fight, but a lion does not expect a honey badger to be a serious problem, and that expectation is the entire advantage." Holt looked down at his notes. He looked like a man whose notes were not helping him. The council deliberated for 2 days. In the end, they issued a formal statement of significant concern regarding the actions of all 4 individuals. noted that no existing legal framework clearly applied to the situation, declined to prosecute on the grounds that what had been done was not clearly prohibited, and recommended that new frameworks be developed for future situations of this kind. It was, Rail said afterward, the most thorough non-answer he had ever received from an official body. They did not know what shelf to put us on, Dell said. They were at a table again, the four of them, in the station's public eating area, which also did not have a name, in a building that did not have a name, on a station that everyone was still arguing about. The food was better than anything at Halcyon Drift, which was not saying a great deal, but it was warm and real, and Nora ate all of hers. There was a message waiting for her when she checked her pad after the council session. It was from Seven, the young Dravath medic who had worked at Sigma 9. She had not expected to hear from him. She had not thought about him much. He had been, in the years at Sigma 9, one of the few people there who had treated her like a subject worth being curious about rather than a thing worth documenting. Small distinction. It had mattered in the way that small distinctions matter when there is not much else. He had found her paper, the dry academic paper on biological resilience she had submitted under a quiet name 18 months ago and expected nobody to read for years. He had found it, and he had read it, and he wrote now not in Dravath standard but in careful, slightly formal trade pidgin, which he had clearly learned recently and specifically. He said he had read the paper 3 times. He said he understood it now. He did not say what understanding it had cost him, or what he intended to do with it. He said, "I think the footnote was right. I do not think we understood what the footnote was about." He did not ask for a reply. Nora read his message twice. Then she did not delete it. She put it in a folder and moved on. "What are you doing next?" Rail asked at the table. "Survey mission," Nora said. "Outer band, 17 uncontacted species." Dell looked at her over his glasses. "Should they be concerned about your arrival?" "Only if they put me in a cell," Nora said. Rail laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out when something is funny and also exactly true at the same time. Yara made a small sound that was probably a laugh wearing a professional exterior. Dell cleaned his glasses and shook his head the way a person shakes their head when they are trying not to smile too much. Nora ate the rest of her food. Outside the station's observation port, the stars moved in their old and patient arcs, indifferent and enormous and full of things nobody had catalogued yet. She was looking forward to that. She had always liked things that had not been catalogued yet, things that nobody had looked at closely enough to understand. There was so much information in the gap between what something appeared to be and what it actually was, if you had the patience to sit in that gap and pay attention. 3 years in a Dravath research station had not taught her patience. She had always had it. What 3 years had taught her was what patience was for. Somewhere on a Sovereignty Core world, in the database of the Dravath Biological Classification System, an entry was being updated. A junior analyst who had been on medical leave for most of the previous year, and had therefore been unaffected by any pharmaceutical anomalies, had pieced together a report over the past 2 months. The report traced every cascading failure of the past 14 months back through its evidence chain and arrived, eventually, at a name and a research file. The updated threat entry for Homo sapiens was brief. It changed the species classification from Class 0, negligible, to unclassified, pending further review. A note was attached recommending that no assumptions be made about members of the species operating in sovereignty-adjacent space until the review was complete. At the bottom of the entry, the original footnote about the honey badger had been moved from its buried position to the top of the file, flagged in the Dravath equivalent of red. It said as it had always said, physically unremarkable, relatively slow, poorly armored, outmatched by almost every predator in its region. And then, as it had always said, the thing that nobody had taken seriously enough, one of the hardest animals on the planet to kill. Underneath it, the analyst had added one line of her own. It said see also Homo sapiens, caution advised. The recommendation was approved. The file was saved. And somewhere in the outer band of mapped space, a ship carrying one human xenobiologist and a survey team made its first jump towards 17 worlds that had never yet seen what a person who had run out of patience with being underestimated could do. The stars did not move for anyone. But they moved for Nora just fine.